Imagine living every single day knowing that one badly timed joke could cost you your life, that making the wrong person laugh, or worse, failing to make the right person laugh, could send you to the dungeon or to the gallows. This was the reality for medieval court jesters, men who wore bells not as symbols of joy, but as chains of golden captivity. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of Thomas the Fool, a man whose survival depended on walking an impossible tightrope between entertainment and execution. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you about a time when laughter came with a price that few were willing to pay, and even fewer survived to tell about. Welcome to another journey through history's forgotten corners, where laughter masks the deepest sorrows, and entertainment becomes a prison of bells and silk. Tonight, we step into the shadowed halls of medieval courts and the sacred stages of ancient worlds, places where a single wrong word could mean death, and where the most brilliant minds hid behind painted smiles and ritual masks. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillow, dim the lights, and let the weight of centuries wash over you like a gentle tide, because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's the story of souls who danced on the edge of disaster, one joke away from the dungeon, one performance away from divine transformation in the flickering candlelight of a medieval castle. Somewhere between the great hall's laughter and the dungeons below lived a man whose very existence was both privilege and curse. He wore bells on his hat, not by choice, but by fate. His name might have been Thomas or Willem or Jean. It doesn't matter now. History remembers the costume, not the man beneath it. He was a court jester, and tonight we'll walk in his soft-soled shoes through a world that demanded constant performance, where silence meant suspicion and sadness could be treason. The jester's day began not when he chose to wake, but when the castle stirred to life. Around him, his quarters, if they could be called that, were tucked behind the kitchens in what had once been a storage closet for grain sacks. The space was just large enough for a straw mattress, a wooden chest containing his few possessions, and perhaps a small wooden cross nailed to the damp stone wall, a reminder that even fools needed salvation. The walls were thick limestone, always damp from the morning mist that rolled across the castle grounds, and thin enough that he could hear the kitchen servants beginning their work before dawn. The sound of iron pots clanging, wood being fed into fires, and hushed conversations about the day's meals served as his daily alarm. There was no luxury of sleeping until he felt rested. His schedule was dictated by the needs and whims of others. As the first pale light of morning filtered through his single narrow window, barely wider than a man's hand, our jester would rise from his makeshift bed. The straw mattress, refilled monthly if he was fortunate, had compressed during the night into something barely softer than the stone floor beneath. His joints ached from the cold and the poor bedding, but such discomfort was simply part of his existence. The wooden chest beside his bed contained everything he owned in the world. Spare bells, carefully wrapped in scraps of cloth to prevent them from chiming accidentally during the night. Patches of colorful fabric for mending his motley when it inevitably tore. A small sewing kit with bone needles and various colored threads, a piece of polished metal that served as his mirror, and hidden beneath a false bottom, wrapped in oiled leather, a small book of prayers, one of the few possessions from his life before the bells, before he became property of the court. The transformation began each morning with the donning of his uniform of humiliation. First came the tunic, that infamous patchwork of colors that no sane person would wear together by choice, yellow and blue sewn next to red and green, purple adjacent to orange, in patterns that seemed designed to offend the eye. The fabric was coarse wool, the cheapest grade available, and it itched constantly against his skin. This discomfort was intentional, a daily reminder that comfort was not for him to enjoy. The tunic's sleeves were deliberately too long, requiring him to push them up constantly or risk tripping over the excess fabric. The hem was uneven, shorter in front than in back, creating an asymmetrical silhouette that made him appear perpetually disheveled. Every aspect of the garment was designed to make him look ridiculous, to ensure that dignity was impossible even in moments of stillness. Then came the infamous coxcomb hat, that multicolored, horn-tipped monstrosity that had become the universal symbol of foolishness. Made of stiffened felt and shaped like a rooster's crest, it rose nearly a foot above his head, making doorways treacherous and low-hanging tapestries an obstacle course. The three-pointed tips, each a different garish color, were fitted with small silver bells that chimed with every movement of his head. These bells were not decorative accessories. They were functional tools of control. They ensured that he could never move silently through the castle corridors, never approach unannounced, never disappear into shadows when solitude was needed. Every nod, every turn of his head, every startled reaction was accompanied by the gentle chiming that announced his presence to all within hearing. The bells also served a psychological purpose, both for him and for those around him. Their constant sound was a reminder of his otherness, his separation from normal human society. To the nobles who heard them, the chimes reinforced his status as entertainment rather than person. To him, they were a daily exercise in accepting humiliation as the price of survival. His shoes were perhaps the cruelest element of his costume, soft leather slippers with exaggerated pointed toes that curled upward and back toward his shins, each tip adorned with yet more bells. The shoes were deliberately impractical, designed to make normal walking difficult and graceful movement nearly impossible. They were perfect for the kind of physical comedy that reminded everyone watching that he was not quite human, at least not in any way that mattered. The soles were thin, offering little protection from cold stone floors or rough cobblestones. In winter, his feet were constantly cold and damp. In summer, they grew hot and uncomfortable in the poorly ventilated leather. But comfort, like dignity, was not something he was meant to enjoy. Around his waist went a belt of rope, rather than leather, often tied in an elaborate knot that served no practical purpose but added to his ridiculous appearance. From this belt hung a small cloth bag containing the tools of his trade, juggling balls made of sewn leather and filled with dried beans, a few colored scarves for simple magic tricks, and perhaps a small wooden flute for accompanying his songs, but the costume was only the beginning of his daily transformation. As he looked into the polished metal that served as his mirror, catching fragments of his reflection in its clouded surface, he had to perform the most difficult trick of all, erasing himself. Whatever thoughts, fears, or sorrows he carried had to be buried beneath the mask of perpetual good humor. The man had to disappear so the fool could take his place. This daily psychological transformation was perhaps the most exhausting part of his existence. Every morning, he had to consciously suppress his own personality, his own reactions to the world around him, his own human responses to joy and sorrow, love and loss. The person he had been before donning the bells, whether peasant farmer, apprentice craftsman, or younger son of a minor noble, had to be buried so completely that sometimes he forgot that person had ever existed. The process required him to practice expressions in his small mirror, ensuring that his face could shift instantly from neutral to comedic, from thoughtful to silly, from genuine emotion to performed cheerfulness. He rehearsed the exaggerated facial expressions that were expected of him, the wide-eyed look of mock surprise, the comically confused frown, the overly bright smile that never quite reached his eyes. He also had to practice his voice, ensuring that he could shift between different characters and accents as his performances required. One moment, he might need to speak in the high, squeaky voice of a merchant's wife, the next in the gruff tones of a country farmer. His natural speaking voice, whatever it might have been, became just another tool in his arsenal of impersonation. Most challenging of all was the mental exercise of viewing himself as others saw him. He had to internalize the perspective that he was amusing rather than intelligent, harmless rather than capable, simple rather than complex. This required a constant splitting of consciousness, part of him observing and judging his own performance, while another part actually lived within the role of the fool. The castle was already alive with activity by the time he emerged from his closet-sized chamber. The morning air carried the scents of baking bread, burning wood, and the inevitable odors of a community where hundreds of people lived in close proximity with limited sanitation. Servants hurried past, carrying buckets of water drawn from the well, bundles of soiled laundry heading to the washing stones by the river, and trays of food destined for the various chambers throughout the keep. None of the servants looked at him directly as he made his way through the corridors. He existed in a strange social limbo that everyone understood, but no one discussed openly. He was too elevated in status to be treated as a common servant. After all, he had direct access to the lord and lady of the castle. He dined in the great hall rather than the kitchens, and his quarters were within the keep itself rather than in the servants' dormitories. But he was also too lowly to be treated with the respect accorded to nobles, clergy, or even wealthy merchants. He was something entirely apart from the normal social hierarchy, a curiosity, a convenience, a thing that happened to breathe and speak and make people laugh. The servants, who understood better than anyone the precarious nature of depending on powerful people for survival, regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and unease. Some of the older servants remembered when he had first arrived at the castle years ago. brought in to replace a previous jester who had died during the harsh winter plague. They had watched him learn the impossible balancing act of being simultaneously visible and invisible, essential and disposable, human and thing. A few, in moments of unusual kindness, had shared extra food or offered warm clothing on particularly cold nights. But such gestures were rare and always discreet. Showing too much concern for the jester's welfare might be interpreted as criticism of how he was treated. His first performance of the day often began before he even reached the great hall. The role of the jester was never confined to formal occasions. He was expected to be on at all times, ready to provide amusement whenever and wherever it might be desired. A serving girl carrying linens might glance his way, and he was expected to wink or perform a little skip that made his bells chime in a pleasing rhythm. A guard posting himself for the morning watch might catch his eye, and suddenly he was juggling imaginary objects or pretending to be startled by his own shadow. These impromptu performances were perhaps the most exhausting aspect of his existence because they required constant vigilance. He could never simply walk through the castle going about ordinary business. Every moment in public was a potential stage, every interaction an opportunity for entertainment. The mental energy required to be perpetually alert for these moments, to always have a joke or gesture ready, was enormous. Yet failing to perform when expected was equally dangerous. If someone clearly anticipated amusement and he failed to provide it, he might be seen as lazy, rebellious, or worse, boring. In a world where his only value lay in his ability to entertain, being perceived as dull was tantamount to a death sentence. The breakfast feast was where the real performance began each day. The great hall stretched before him like a theater of judgment, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows above, its stone walls lined with tapestries depicting heroic battles and noble hunts. Trestle tables arranged in careful hierarchy filled the space, their placement a precise map of social standing and political alliance. At the high table, elevated on a dais at the far end of the hall, sat Lord Aldrich and Lady Margaret, their children, and whatever visiting dignitaries had arrived during the night. The Lord was a man in his middle years, his once lean frame now softened by prosperity and rich food. His beard, carefully trimmed and oiled, showed streaks of gray that he claimed came from the wisdom of leadership, but which everyone knew came from the stress of managing a domain in increasingly uncertain times. Lady Margaret sat beside him, her clothing a careful display of wealth and taste. Her dress was made of fine wool, dyed the deep blue that came from expensive indigo, and her headdress was decorated with small pearls that caught the morning light. She was younger than her husband by a decade, married to him when she was barely 16, as part of an alliance between their fathers. Now, at 26, she had grown into the role of chatelaine, with grace and intelligence, though her smiles rarely reached her eyes. Below the high table, arranged by strict hierarchy, were the various courtiers, knights, and wealthy merchants who made up the castle's social ecosystem. Sir Edmund, the Lord's eldest knight and most trusted military advisor, sat with his fellow men-at-arms, their conversation already turning to the day's training exercises and patrol schedules. Master Robert, the steward who managed the castle's vast financial affairs, reviewed ledgers between bites of bread, his mind already calculating grain stores and tax collections. At the lower tables sat the castle's essential but less prestigious inhabitants, the head cook, the master carpenter, the captain of the guard, and various craftsmen whose skills were valued but whose blood was common. Even here, seating was carefully arranged according to complex protocols that everyone understood, but no one explicitly discussed. Our jester entered to the sound of his own bells, chiming softly with each step, and immediately every eye in the hall turned toward him. The conversations didn't stop completely, but they shifted in tone and content, becoming more performative, more conscious of their audience. Everyone present understood that they were now part of a show, whether they wanted to be or not. The attention focused on him was not warm or welcoming, but expectant. These people were hungry, not for the food being served, though the castle's cooks had prepared fresh bread, porridge sweetened with honey, eggs from the henhouse, and strips of salted pork. But for entertainment, they wanted amusement, distraction from their daily concerns, relief from the tensions that always simmered beneath the surface of court life. "Fool," called Lord Aldrich, his voice carrying easily across the hall. He used the title rather than the jester's name, as was customary. It reinforced the man's function rather than his identity. "We have visitors from the French court. Show them how we keep our spirits light here in England." The jester's heart sank, even as his face automatically arranged itself into an expression of eager compliance. Foreign visitors meant heightened expectations and increased danger, a joke that might amuse the local nobles, who understood the subtle references to shared experiences and local personalities, could easily offend foreign sensibilities. Political tensions between kingdoms could turn even innocent humor into diplomatic incidents. But there was no choice, no moment to hesitate, no possibility of begging off due to lack of inspiration. He bowed deeply, the motion making his bells chime in a melodic cascade, and began his morning routine. He started with physical comedy, always the safer choice when the audience included strangers. Physical humor translated across language barriers and cultural differences in ways that verbal wit often did not. He pretended to trip over his own feet, exaggerating the stumble and recovery for maximum effect. His arms windmilled comically as he fought to regain his balance, and he ended with an elaborate bow that suggested the near fall had been intentional all along. The French visitors chuckled politely, their amusement genuine if restrained. Encouraged, he moved to juggling, accepting pieces of bread that servants handed him and tossing them in increasingly complex patterns. He let one fall dramatically, catching it with his foot and flicking it back into the air with a movement that drew appreciative murmurs from the audience. Mild laughter rippled through the hall, and he felt the familiar rush of relief that came with successful entertainment. But he also noticed Lord Aldrich's slight frown, the narrowing of eyes that suggested the performance was adequate but not exceptional. In the complex dynamics of court entertainment, merely adequate was often insufficient. "Come now," Lord Aldrich called out, his tone carrying an edge of challenge. Surely you can do better than child's play. Tell us something clever about our French friends. This was the moment every jester feared, the request for improvised wit that walked the razor's edge between humor and insult, the demand for verbal cleverness that could entertain the home audience while either flattering or gently mocking the guests, depending on the political climate and the Lord's current mood toward their visitors. Too mild, and he would be dismissed as boring, his reputation for wit called into question. Too sharp, and he might offend the wrong person, creating diplomatic tension or personal enmity that could have consequences far beyond a single meal. The French diplomat at the high table, a thin man with calculating eyes and an elaborate doublet that spoke of wealth and position, watched him with the intensity of a cat studying a mouse. The jester took a breath, feeling the weight of dozens of expectant gazes, and made his choice. The decision had to be instant, based on years of experience, reading crowds and gauging the political temperature of any given moment. My lord, he said, affecting a theatrical bow toward the French visitors, while keeping his tone light and playful, I was just thinking how fortunate we are that our French friends arrived when they did. Had they come last week, during the rain, they might have melted, being made of such fine sugar as they are. The hall held its breath for a moment that lasted an eternity. Every person present understood that the success or failure of this joke would set the tone for the entire meal, possibly for the entire visit. The jester himself stood frozen, his smile maintaining its proper shape, while his mind raced through all the ways his words might be interpreted. Then the French diplomat threw back his head and laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that released the tension in the room, like a cork popping from a wine bottle. Sugar, indeed. We French are sweet enough to dissolve in your English rain, though I suspect we would leave a most pleasant taste. The tension broke like a fever, and laughter filled the hall. Conversations resumed with renewed energy, and the jester felt the familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion that came with navigating such moments successfully. But even as he smiled and accepted the scattered applause, he understood how close he had come to disaster. Had the diplomat taken offense, had Lord Aldrich interpreted the joke as too bold or insufficiently respectful, the morning could have ended very differently. As the laughter died down and the nobles returned to their meal, discussing grain prices and marriage alliances and the possibility of rain damaging the harvest, the jester retreated to the edges of the hall. This movement was as choreographed as any formal dance. He had to remain visible and available while simultaneously making himself unobtrusive, present but not invasive. This was another aspect of his existence that few people understood, the constant vigilance required to read the room's emotional temperature, to sense when his presence was desired and when it was merely tolerated. He had learned to position himself where he could observe everything while drawing minimal attention, usually near one of the great tapestries that lined the walls, where his colorful costume might blend with the woven images of knights and dragons and flowering vines. From his position near the wall, he could observe the intricate dance of court politics unfolding around him like a complex musical composition. Every glance between nobles carried meaning. Every pause in conversation suggested unspoken tensions. every laugh served multiple purposes beyond simple amusement. Lady Margaret leaned close to her husband's ear, whispering something urgent about grain stores running low due to the wet spring. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her fingers worried at the expensive ring on her left hand, a tell the jester had learned to recognize as a sign of genuine concern rather than routine domestic management. Sir Edmund's hand lingered too long on the wrist of Lord Aldrich's youngest daughter as he helped her reach a platter of fruit, and the girl's blush suggested the attention was not entirely unwelcome. But the knight's eyes darted nervously toward the high table, calculating whether anyone with authority had noticed the interaction. The French diplomat made careful notes in a small leather journal between courses, recording details that might prove useful to his king: the quality of the food, the richness of the tapestries, the number of armed men visible in the hall, the overall prosperity or poverty of the household. His mission was diplomatic, but intelligence gathering was always part of such visits. Master Robert, the steward, excused himself early from the meal, his face tight with worry as he headed toward the tower room where the castle's financial records were kept. The jester had overheard enough conversations to know that tax collection had been poor this year, and several tenant farmers had failed to deliver their required portions of the harvest. The jester saw it all, heard it all, remembered it all. This was perhaps his most dangerous skill, the ability to fade into the background while remaining perfectly alert. Nobles spoke freely around him because they had trained themselves to see him as harmless, as barely human. His colorful costume and constant performance created a kind of camouflage that made him simultaneously visible and invisible. But he was neither harmless nor unintelligent, and the secrets he accumulated were more valuable than gold. He knew which knights were embezzling from the Lord's treasury, skimming profits from tax collection, and hoping their theft would be blamed on poor harvest yields. He knew which ladies were conducting affairs, meeting their lovers in supposedly empty chambers during the afternoon rest period. He knew that Master William, the castle's head mason, had been using inferior stone in the new tower construction, pocketing the difference in cost, and hoping the deception wouldn't be discovered until long after the work was completed. He knew that Brother Francis, the elderly chaplain, had been quietly sheltering runaway serfs in the abbey, helping them reach ports where they might find passage to lands where their labor would be their own. Most dangerously of all, he knew that Lord Aldrich himself was far more worried about the political situation than he let on. The king's demands for military service had increased dramatically, but the Lord's ability to field and equip soldiers had decreased due to poor harvests and ongoing conflicts with neighboring lords. Satisfying the crown's requirements might require making alliances or compromises that could destabilize the region for years. This knowledge was both asset and liability. Sometimes, Lord Aldrich would summon him for private conversations, fishing for information gathered during his invisible moments. These sessions were among the most terrifying aspects of his existence, requiring him to walk an impossibly narrow line between useful cooperation and dangerous betrayal. "Tell me, fool," Lord Aldrich had said during one such private audience, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something much harder and more calculating. What did you hear when Bishop Clarence spoke with Sir Marcus yesterday evening? And there it was, the terrible choice that defined his existence: remain silent and face punishment for withholding information that might be crucial to his lord's interests, or speak and become complicit in whatever consequences followed. Every such moment forced him to weigh loyalty against survival, truth against safety. The jester had learned to navigate these requests with careful ambiguity, offering enough information to satisfy his lord's curiosity while avoiding outright betrayal of those whose secrets he had accidentally overheard. "My lord," he had replied, arranging his features into an expression of earnest helpfulness tinged with apologetic confusion. "I heard two men discussing the weather and the quality of the wine served at dinner. Their voices were low, and I confess my ears are better suited to the sound of laughter than to serious conversation." Though I believe the bishop expressed concern about the roads being too muddy for comfortable travel, it was neither lie nor complete truth. A jester's answer, carefully crafted to protect both himself and others, while providing enough substance to suggest cooperation. The skill required for such verbal dancing was exhausting, requiring him to think several moves ahead, like a chess player anticipating his opponent's strategy. Such conversations also reminded him of how precarious his position truly was. His value to Lord Aldrich lay not just in his ability to entertain, but in his access to information that others couldn't obtain. Yet this same access made him dangerous, a man who knew too much about too many people's private business. The morning meal concluded gradually as nobles finished their food and began dispersing to their various daily activities. Some would join hunting parties, others would attend to estate business, and the ladies might gather for embroidery or music lessons with the traveling minstrel who had arrived the previous week. But the jester's day was far from over. He was expected to be available at any moment, ready to appear wherever boredom might strike or tension might need diffusing. His schedule was not his own. It belonged to anyone who outranked him, which meant virtually everyone in the castle. As the hall emptied, he made his way toward the courtyard, where the castle's children often gathered to play during the morning hours. Here, at least, his presence was genuinely welcome rather than merely tolerated. The young ones had not yet learned to see him as beneath them in the complex hierarchy that governed adult interactions. To them, he was simply the funny man who could make coins disappear and pull silk scarves from empty air. Little Lady Eleanor, perhaps 6 years old, ran to him with the pure joy that adults had long since forgotten how to express. Her dress was a miniature version of her mother's formal attire, but grass stains on the hem and dirt on her hands revealed that she had been playing with the energy and enthusiasm of childhood. "Thomas the Fool," she called out, using his actual name in the unconscious way of children who had not yet learned the social protocols that required addressing him by his function rather than his identity. "Show me the magic with the ribbons." He smiled, genuinely this time, the expression reaching his eyes in a way it rarely did during formal performances. Children were perhaps the only audience with whom he could be partially authentic, their delight genuine rather than politic. He reached into his belt pouch and withdrew several colored silk scarves, beginning the simple sleight of hand that never failed to delight young audiences. The trick was basic, making scarves appear to multiply in his hands through careful manipulation and misdirection. But Eleanor watched with rapt attention, as if witnessing genuine magic. Her wonder was infectious, and soon other children had gathered around, abandoning their games of tag and hide and seek to watch his impromptu performance. For a few precious minutes, surrounded by their innocent laughter and genuine appreciation, he could almost forget the weight of his bells, the constant performance of his adult life, the knowledge that grew heavier with each passing day. Here, in the courtyard with the children, he remembered what laughter could be when it was untainted by politics or social calculation. But even these moments of peace carried their own subtle tensions. He had to be careful not to grow too fond of the children, not to let them see too much of the man beneath the costume. They would grow up, learn their places in the hierarchy, and eventually look upon him with the same mixture of amusement and disdain as their parents. Young Lord Geoffrey, Eleanor's older brother at 8 years old, was already beginning to show signs of this transformation. His requests for entertainment were becoming more commanding, less polite, and he had recently begun referring to him as fool rather than Thomas, in imitation of the adults around him. Still, for now, these moments in the courtyard provided something approaching genuine human connection. The children's laughter was real, their joy unfeigned, their attention freely given rather than demanded by social protocol. In their presence, he could remember what it felt like to bring happiness to others without calculation or fear. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the cobblestones, our jester prepared himself for the long day ahead. There would be more meals, more performances, more careful navigation through the treacherous waters of court life, where every word carried multiple meanings and every gesture might be interpreted as significant. Each bell that chimed with his movement was a reminder of his captivity, a musical notation in the symphony of his constrained existence. Each laugh he earned was a small victory against the forces that sought to diminish him, proof that even in the most controlled circumstances, something authentic could still break through. But perhaps the cruelest irony of all was this: in a world that demanded he be constantly amusing, he was forbidden from finding genuine amusement himself. His laughter was a tool, his wit a weapon, his joy a performance. The man beneath the bells had to find his own quiet moments of peace in the spaces between acts, in the brief interludes when no one was watching and he could simply exist without entertaining anyone. And so the day continued, as all his days continued, in a rhythm of performance and vigilance, of hidden truths and public spectacle. The medieval court jester lived at the center of power, yet remained powerless, surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone, gifted with the license to speak truth, yet forbidden from speaking his own. This was his world, beautiful and terrible, glittering and dark, where the price of making others laugh was often the sacrifice of his own happiness. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, he was both essential thread and disposable ornament, woven into the fabric of court society, yet always at risk of being cut away if his pattern no longer pleased those who held the shears. As afternoon settled over the castle, like a heavy tapestry, the shadows grew longer, and the stone walls seemed to whisper secrets of ages past. In these quieter hours, when the nobles retreated to their chambers for rest or private business, our jester found himself in what might charitably be called his free time. But freedom, for a man in bells, was always relative, a conditional gift that could be revoked at any moment by anyone with sufficient authority. The castle in afternoon was a different creature than it had been at morning's feast. The great hall stood mostly empty, its long tables cleared of dishes and stripped of their linen coverings. Servants moved through the space with quiet efficiency, sweeping rushes from the floor and replacing the herbs that had been scattered among them to combat the ever-present odors of communal living. The tapestries that lined the walls seemed more vivid in the slanted afternoon light, their woven battles and hunts taking on an almost lifelike quality that made the jester feel observed by painted eyes. He made his way through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, stern-faced lords and ladies who had never known the indignity of entertaining others for survival. Their oil-painted features seemed to follow him as he passed, expressions frozen in permanent judgment of his colorful attire and jingling bells. These were the bloodlines that had built this castle, stone by stone, generation by generation. Their legacy was written in architecture and land ownership, in marriage alliances and military victories. Thomas wondered if they, too, had once harbored jesters in their courts, if somewhere in the long history of this castle, other men had walked these same stones, wearing similar costumes of enforced humility. Had they found moments of genuine connection amid the performance? Had they ever been allowed to speak their own truths? Or had they all lived and died as vessels for other people's amusement? The library was one of the few places where he could find something approaching peace. Most nobles were illiterate, and those who could read rarely bothered with the dusty tomes that lined these walls from floor to vaulted ceiling. The room smelled of parchment and ink, beeswax candles, and the faint mustiness that came from centuries of accumulated knowledge, slowly aging in the damp English climate. Here, among the chronicles of dead kings and treatises on agriculture, theology, and natural philosophy, he could disappear for precious minutes at a time. The silence was different from the tense quiet that sometimes fell over the great hall. This was a peaceful silence, broken only by the soft scratching of quill on parchment and the occasional turning of pages. Brother Francis, the castle's elderly chaplain and keeper of the books, had long ago grown accustomed to his presence. The old monk had arrived at the castle decades earlier, when the current Lord Aldrich's father had still ruled. He had seen jesters come and go, had witnessed the rise and fall of courtiers, had performed funeral rites for warriors and wedding ceremonies for children who seemed too young for such serious commitments. Brother Francis had never shown Thomas particular kindness, but neither had he shown cruelty, a rare neutrality that the jester treasured like gold. In a world where every interaction carried potential danger, the monk's indifference felt like a blessing. "Reading again, are we?" Brother Francis would mutter without looking up from his copying work, his gnarled fingers moving with surprising steadiness as he transcribed Latin texts onto fresh parchment. Careful that your bells don't wake the old histories. They're particular about noise. It was the closest thing to humor the old monk ever displayed, this gentle teasing about the jester's constant musical accompaniment. But there was no malice in it, no attempt to remind him of his lowly status. It was simply acknowledgement, one human being noting the presence of another without judgment or expectation. The jester had taught himself to read years ago, during the long winter nights when sleep refused to come, and the darkness seemed to press against his small window like a living thing. It had been a slow, painstaking process, stealing moments with discarded pieces of parchment, puzzling out letters by candlelight, gradually building vocabulary from overheard conversations and fragments of text. Learning to read had been both liberation and additional burden. It opened doors to worlds beyond the castle walls, to ideas and stories that existed independent of his immediate circumstances. But it also made him more dangerous, more aware of the forces that shaped his world. Knowledge, like jokes, could be weaponized against those who possessed it. A literate jester was an anomaly that might attract unwanted attention from those who preferred their entertainers ignorant and harmless. Today, he found himself drawn to a chronicle of ancient Roman entertainers, slaves and freedmen who had performed in the great amphitheaters for the amusement of crowds that numbered in the tens of thousands. Their circumstances had been different from his own, but their essential tragedy was remarkably similar. Brilliant minds forced to diminish themselves for the pleasure of others. Talented individuals reduced to amusing objects in a system that valued spectacle over humanity. Some had won their freedom through their performances, earning enough coin and favor to purchase their independence. Others had died in the arena, their bodies broken for the entertainment of audiences who forgot them before the blood had dried on the sand. But most had simply faded from history, their names lost to time, while the emperors they had served were remembered in marble statues and triumphal arches. Reading their stories was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it reminded him that his struggles were not unique, that throughout history others had faced similar challenges and found ways to endure. Disturbing because it suggested that his own fate might be similarly forgotten, his life and struggles lost to the passage of time. A commotion in the courtyard drew him from his reading. The sound of horses and heavy wagon wheels on cobblestones cutting through the library's peaceful atmosphere. Through the narrow window, little more than an arrow slit widened to admit light, he could see a crowd gathering around what appeared to be a traveling merchant's cart. Such arrivals were always occasions for excitement in the isolated castle, bringing news from the outside world and goods that couldn't be produced locally. But as he watched, positioning himself carefully to avoid being seen while still maintaining a view of the proceedings, the jester realized this was no ordinary merchant. The man directing the unloading wore the black robes of a church official, and the items being carefully removed from the cart were not goods for trade, but instruments of spiritual authority. A portable altar draped in rich cloth, sacred relics contained in jeweled boxes, and most ominously, a wooden chest that could only contain the tools of divine judgment. A traveling inquisitor had arrived. The jester's blood turned cold, a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. Inquisitors were not men who appreciated humor, particularly the kind of irreverent wit that was his stock in trade. They viewed laughter with a deep suspicion, seeing in it the potential for blasphemy, rebellion, or the kind of free thinking that could undermine ecclesiastical authority. For a man whose livelihood depended on making light of serious matters, finding humor in human folly, and occasionally pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, the arrival of such a figure was a death sentence waiting to be pronounced. He watched as Lord Aldrich emerged from the keep to greet the visitor, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something approaching reverence. Even powerful nobles stepped carefully around men who claimed to speak for God directly, who had the authority to declare anyone a heretic, and who could call upon the full power of the Church to enforce their judgments. The king himself was known to defer to particularly influential inquisitors, understanding that challenging church authority could bring consequences that extended far beyond any single kingdom. Brother Francis appeared beside him at the window, moving with a silent step that came from decades of monastic discipline. His lined face was grave as he observed the scene below, and Thomas could see tension in the old monk's shoulders that spoke of deep concern. "Father Benedict," Brother Francis whispered, his voice barely audible, even in the library silence. "I knew his reputation would bring him here eventually. He has strong views about the proper conduct of Christian courts. What does that mean for someone like me?" the jester asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. His voice was equally quiet, but his bells chimed softly with the movement of his head, an ironic, musical punctuation to their serious conversation. "It means," Brother Francis said quietly, not meeting his eyes, "that you should be very careful about the nature of your wit in the coming days. Father Benedict believes that laughter is too often the devil's music, and those who make others laugh are suspect in his view. He sees frivolity as a mask for spiritual corruption, and those who encourage it as potential agents of chaos." The old monk paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully before continuing. "He has written treatises on the subject. In his view, a truly Christian court should be a place of solemn reflection and constant prayer. Entertainment, particularly of the kind you provide, is seen as distraction from proper spiritual focus." The jester nodded, his mind already racing through the implications. Every joke he had told that might be construed as irreverent, every moment of levity that could be twisted into evidence of ungodliness, every second of his existence that had brought joy rather than solemn reflection, all of it could now be held against him as evidence of spiritual corruption. Worse still, his very existence as a court entertainer put him in direct opposition to Father Benedict's vision of proper Christian behavior. He couldn't simply reform his act or modify his approach. His entire function was antithetical to what the Inquisitor believed courts should represent. As they watched from the window, Father Benedict completed his inspection of the unloaded materials and turned his attention to the castle itself. Even from a distance, the jester could see the calculating way the man's eyes moved across the courtyard, cataloging details, noting the presence of decorative elements that might be deemed excessive observing the behavior of servants and nobles alike. The Inquisitor was not a large man physically, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made size irrelevant. His movements were precise and deliberate, suggesting a mind that approached everything methodically. This was not someone who would be swayed by charm or distracted by humor. This was a man who saw the world in terms of spiritual warfare, where every laugh might hide a sin and every moment of joy could mask deeper corruption. As evening approached, the great hall was transformed for a formal dinner in honor of the visiting Inquisitor. The usual boisterous atmosphere was replaced by something much more subdued, as if the very air had been drained of its normal vitality. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and the laughter that normally punctuated meals was notably absent. The servants moved with unusual care, their normal easy chatter replaced by nervous efficiency. Even the kitchen staff, normally insulated from court politics by their practical duties, seemed to understand that something significant had changed in the castle's atmosphere. Platters were carried with extra reverence. Wine was poured with ceremonial precision, and the usual friendly banter between servers and diners had vanished entirely. Father Benedict took his place at the high table beside Lord Aldrich. His dark robes, a stark contrast to the colorful tapestries that decorated the walls and the rich clothing worn by the assembled nobles. He was a lean man with piercing eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings, storing them away for later examination and judgment. When his gaze fell upon the jester, it lingered with unmistakable disapproval, as if he were looking at a stain that needed to be cleaned. The meal proceeded in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the necessary courtesies and stilted attempts at appropriate conversation. Lord Aldrich made several efforts to lighten the mood, but each attempt fell flat against the Inquisitor's stony demeanor. The usual topics of conversation, hunting, weather, local gossip, seemed suddenly inappropriate in the presence of someone whose attention was fixed on higher, more serious matters. Finally, perhaps out of desperation or misguided hospitality, Lord Aldrich gestured toward the jester. Father Benedict, we are honored to have such a distinguished guest at our table. Perhaps our fool might entertain you with some harmless diversion. He is quite skilled at appropriate humor. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the jester felt every eye in the hall turn toward him, but none more intensely than those of the Inquisitor, whose gaze seemed to pierce through costume and performance to examine the soul beneath. For a moment that seemed to stretch into hours, Father Benedict studied him in silence, his expression unreadable but undeniably judgmental. Then, with deliberate precision that made every word carry extra weight, he spoke. I have observed this person since my arrival, and I confess myself troubled by what I see. In my travels throughout Christendom, I have learned to be wary of those who make their living through mockery and jest. Such individuals often serve as vectors for spiritual corruption, spreading doubt and irreverence through communities that should be focused on salvation. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Tell me, fool, do you mock only earthly things, or do you extend your irreverence to matters sacred? Do you encourage others to laugh at the very foundations of their faith? It was a trap, elegantly constructed and impossible to escape unscathed. Any attempt at humor would be seen as confirmation of his suspected blasphemy, proof that he treated sacred matters with insufficient reverence. But refusing to perform would be seen as insubordination, possibly even defiance of the Church's authority to examine and judge his fitness for his position. The jester knelt carefully, his bells chiming softly in the silent hall like a funeral bell, marking the death of easier times. Father, I am but a simple man who seeks only to bring innocent joy to others. I would no sooner mock our Savior than I would mock my own mother, for both have shown me more mercy than I deserve. It was carefully worded, humble without being obsequious, religious without claiming too much piety. He had learned over the years to navigate such treacherous conversations by speaking in generalities that could be interpreted charitably while avoiding specific commitments that might be used against him later. But Father Benedict was not so easily satisfied. His years of experience in examining the spiritual fitness of courts and individuals had taught him to probe deeper, to look for the subtle signs of corruption that others might miss. Indeed, then perhaps you would share with us some example of this innocent joy. Show us humor that elevates the soul rather than degrading it. Demonstrate that your craft can serve God's purposes rather than undermining them. The challenge was clear, and the jester understood that his very life might depend on his response. He rose slowly, his mind racing through every joke, every story, every piece of physical comedy in his repertoire, searching desperately for something that might satisfy the Inquisitor's impossible standards while still maintaining some resemblance to entertainment. The assembled nobles watched with the fascination of spectators at an execution, understanding that they were witnessing something that would define the future of their court. Some seemed genuinely concerned for his welfare, while others appeared curious to see how this confrontation between sacred and secular authority would resolve itself. What followed was perhaps the most carefully calculated performance of his life. He told a gentle story about a humble farmer who discovered that his prayers were more effective when he included requests for his animals' welfare alongside his own, learning through this experience that God's love extended to all his creatures. The tale included moments of mild humor, the farmer's conversations with his animals, his surprise at discovering their apparent spiritual needs, but everything was carefully framed within acceptable religious themes. It was barely a joke at all, more of a moral tale with mildly amusing elements, but it served its immediate purpose. The story promoted proper religious sentiment while providing just enough entertainment value to justify his presence in the hall. Every word had been chosen to demonstrate orthodoxy while maintaining the pretense of performance. Father Benedict listened in complete silence, his expression unreadable throughout the telling. When the story concluded to polite but nervous applause from the assembled nobles, he nodded once, a gesture that might have been approval or might have been the acknowledgement of a temporary reprieve. Interesting, he said finally, his voice giving nothing away. I shall be curious to observe more of your ministry during my stay. The word ministry hung in the air like a challenge and a threat. The jester understood that he was now under constant observation, that every word and gesture would be scrutinized for signs of impiety or spiritual corruption. His already constrained existence had just become a prison of silk and bells, where even the smallest misstep could have fatal consequences. As the evening wore on, the usual entertainment was conspicuously absent. Musicians played only sacred songs, carefully chosen hymns that reinforced proper religious sentiment. Conversation revolved around matters of church doctrine and moral instruction, with nobles demonstrating their orthodoxy through careful discussions of theological topics they barely understood. The jester found himself relegated to the shadows, neither dismissed nor acknowledged, existing in a liminal space that felt increasingly dangerous. He was visible enough to be observed and judged, but not invited to participate in the elevated conversation that now dominated the hall. When the meal finally ended and the nobles began to disperse, Lord Aldrich approached him with unusual directness, abandoning the public pretense that the jester was merely an amusing object rather than a person capable of serious conversation. Thomas, he said quietly, using the jester's actual name for perhaps the first time in years, I trust you understand the delicacy of our current situation. Father Benedict's presence here is not entirely social. There have been questions raised about the spiritual health of my court. The jester felt his world shifting beneath his feet like sand, giving way to deeper currents. The Inquisitor's arrival was not coincidental. Someone had reported concerns about the court's religious observance, and among those concerns was almost certainly his own irreverent behavior. His jokes, his performances, his very existence as a source of secular entertainment had been identified as potential evidence of spiritual corruption. My lord, he replied carefully, I have always endeavored to serve with humility and to bring only innocent pleasure to your household. If I have given offense through ignorance rather than malice, I beg your guidance in correcting my errors. I know, Thomas, I know. Lord Aldrich's voice carried genuine regret, and for a moment the powerful nobleman seemed almost as trapped by circumstances as the jester himself. But perhaps, for the duration of Father Benedict's visit, it would be wise to err on the side of solemnity. The survival of this household may depend on demonstrating our commitment to proper Christian behavior. It was as close to a warning as Lord Aldrich could offer, without explicitly acknowledging that the jester's life was in danger. And Thomas accepted it with the gratitude of a drowning man offered a rope. But as he made his way back to his small chamber that night, he understood that something fundamental had changed in his world. The precarious balance that had allowed him to survive in this environment of competing demands had been upset, and he was no longer certain it could be restored. Father Benedict represented a force that could not be charmed, amused, or distracted, a will focused entirely on rooting out what he saw as spiritual corruption, regardless of the human cost. In the darkness of his room, surrounded by the tools of his trade that now seemed like evidence of his guilt, Thomas contemplated a future that might hold none of these familiar comforts. The juggling balls seemed to mock him with their bright colors. The musical instruments whispered of songs that might never again be safe to sing, and the colorful scarves that had brought so much joy and laughter now felt like chains binding him to a doomed profession. Perhaps it was time to learn new skills, to find new ways of being useful that didn't depend on the dangerous gift of making others laugh. But even as he considered these possibilities, he knew that changing himself so fundamentally might mean losing the only identity he had ever known. The man beneath the bells was so thoroughly hidden, even from himself, that he wasn't sure who that person might be if stripped of performance and pretense. Outside his window, the castle settled into sleep, its inhabitants dreaming whatever dreams came to those who lived with the constant awareness that their spiritual fitness was being evaluated by higher authorities. In the tower where Father Benedict had established his temporary quarters, a light burned late into the night. The Inquisitor, reviewing notes, planning examinations, preparing to root out corruption wherever it might hide. And in his small room, a man whose only crime was bringing joy to a joyless world lay awake, listening to the wind through the castle's stones and wondering if tomorrow would bring salvation or damnation. The bells beside his bed lay silent in the darkness, waiting for another day of performance, another opportunity to dance on the edge of disaster. But perhaps, if he was very careful and very lucky, there might still be a chance to find some form of redemption, not through abandoning who he was, but through discovering who he might become. In a world that demanded constant transformation for a survival, the game had changed, but it was not yet over. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, the most unexpected alliances could form between those who understood what it meant to live under the constant threat of judgment. Dawn came gray and cold, filtered through clouds that promised more than rain. They carried the weight of judgment itself. Thomas woke to the sound of unusual activity in the corridors, a nervous energy that seemed to pulse through the very stones of the castle. Servants moved with hushed urgency, their normal chatter replaced by whispered conversations that died abruptly whenever footsteps approached. As he dressed with even greater care than usual, ensuring every bell was properly secured and every patch of his motley precisely arranged, he could hear the sounds of construction resuming in the courtyard. Through his narrow window, he glimpsed men assembling what could only be a platform, not for entertainment, but for public demonstration of some kind. The sight of it sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. The great hall was subdued when he entered for the morning meal, but subdued in a different way than the previous evening. Where yesterday had been uncomfortable silence, today carried an undercurrent of barely controlled fear. Many of the usual faces were absent from their customary places, and those who remained spoke in voices so low they could barely be heard above the crackling of the great fireplace. Lord Aldrich looked as though he had aged a decade overnight, his usually ruddy complexion pale and drawn. Lady Margaret sat beside him, with her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Even the children were subdued, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. Father Benedict occupied his place at the high table with the calm satisfaction of a man whose work was proceeding according to plan. He ate methodically, his movements precise and deliberate, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. When his eyes swept the hall, people seemed to shrink into themselves, as if hoping to become invisible under his scrutiny. No one called for entertainment. No one so much as looked in the jester's direction. He stood near his customary place by the wall, part of the furnishings, but clearly under observation. Every person in that hall was calculating their words and actions, trying to appear sufficiently pious to avoid suspicion while maintaining enough dignity to preserve their standing in the complex social hierarchy. It was then that he noticed her again, the woman he had glimpsed the previous day, but never really observed until now. She moved through the hall with the practiced invisibility of a skilled servant, refilling wine cups and replacing spent candles. But there was something about her movements that suggested a deeper awareness of the conversations around her. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of unremarkable features that allowed her to blend into any crowd. Her dress marked her as household staff, probably attached to one of the visiting ladies, but she carried herself with a subtle confidence that spoke of intelligence, carefully hidden beneath a facade of humble service. As Thomas watched, he began to notice the pattern of her movements. She seemed to linger near certain conversations, her attention focused in ways that went beyond simple service duties. When she approached Lady Margaret under the pretense of adjusting a tapestry, their brief exchange carried an intensity that suggested more than domestic concerns. During the morning's tense proceedings, word spread through the castle like wildfire. Willem the blacksmith had been arrested during the night. The man who had shod horses and mended weapons for the castle's defense, who had always been generous with his skills and kind to the poorest servants, was now imprisoned in the tower, awaiting examination by Father Benedict. The charges, whispered from servant to servant in fragments of overheard conversation, were both absurd and terrifying. Willem had been observed making protective signs while he worked, hanging iron horseshoes above doorways for luck, muttering what Father Benedict deemed pagan incantations during his smithing. These were traditions as old as metalworking itself, harmless customs that countless generations had practiced without thinking. But under the piercing gaze of an inquisitor, such habits became evidence of heresy, proof of spiritual corruption that threatened the very foundations of Christian society. If a respected craftsman could be arrested for such minor transgressions, what hope did a professional fool have for survival? The jester found himself drawn to the library again, seeking refuge among Brother Francis's books and manuscripts. But even this sanctuary felt different now, charged with tension and the constant awareness that privacy might be an illusion. The old monk was there, as always, but his usual steady demeanor showed cracks of strain. "Have you heard?" Brother Francis whispered, as Thomas approached his reading desk. Poor Willem, 30 years of faithful service, and now this. Father Benedict sees corruption in traditions that predate Christianity in these lands. What will happen to him? Thomas asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. That depends on what he confesses, the old monk replied, his voice heavy with sadness, and what Father Benedict chooses to see as evidence of repentance versus evidence of deeper corruption. They were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps, and both men looked up to see the servant woman from the hall entering the library. She moved with the same careful precision Thomas had observed during meals, but here, away from the formal spaces of the court, she seemed somehow more substantial, more present. "Brother Francis," she said quietly. Forgive the intrusion, but I bring word from Lady Margaret. She wishes to know if the texts you mentioned might be available for private study. The old monk's eyes sharpened slightly, and Thomas sensed an undercurrent of communication that went beyond the literal meaning of her words. Ah, yes, Brother Francis replied carefully. The devotional works. I believe they could be quite illuminating for a lady seeking to deepen her spiritual understanding. The woman nodded, then turned to Thomas with a directness that surprised him. And you, Master Jester, how do you find the library's offerings? Do they provide guidance for those seeking to serve God more faithfully? There was something in her tone, a subtle emphasis on certain words, that suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface conversation. Thomas felt as though he were being tested, evaluated for some purpose he couldn't yet understand. I find great comfort in the wisdom of ages past, he replied carefully. Stories of those who faced trials with faith and courage provide inspiration for navigating difficult times. She smiled slightly, the first genuine expression he had seen from her. Indeed, sometimes the oldest wisdom proves most relevant to current challenges. After she left, Brother Francis continued his copying work in thoughtful silence for several minutes before speaking again. Mary is perceptive in matters of spiritual guidance, he said finally. She has helped several members of the household develop a deeper understanding of their faith. The emphasis on certain words, the careful phrasing, the meaningful glances, Thomas began to understand that he was being introduced to something hidden but significant. In this castle, where survival depended on navigating invisible currents of power and influence, new alliances were being offered to those wise enough to recognize them. As the day progressed, the tension in the castle continued to build, like pressure before a thunderstorm. The sounds that echoed from the tower where Willem was being questioned were enough to make even hardened knights wince and cross themselves. Father Benedict's methods of extracting truth were thorough, and by all accounts, extremely persuasive. Thomas found himself summoned to attend the afternoon meal, though the word entertainment was notably absent from the invitation. Instead, he was instructed to be present should moral instruction be required. The phrasing chilled him. It suggested his role was being fundamentally redefined from entertainer to something much more dangerous. The great hall was arranged differently for this meal, with chairs positioned to face a small raised platform that had been constructed near the fireplace. Father Benedict sat not at the high table, but in a central position where he could observe everyone present. The arrangement felt more like a tribunal than a social gathering. My friends, Father Benedict began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, I have spent this day in prayer and contemplation, seeking divine guidance regarding the spiritual health of this community. What I have discovered troubles me deeply. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. Corruption has taken root here, masquerading as harmless tradition and innocent amusement. But we know that Satan is cunning, using pleasure and laughter to distract souls from their proper devotion to the Almighty. Thomas felt every eye in the hall turn toward him, though Father Benedict had not yet looked in his direction. The implication was clear. As the primary source of amusement in the court, he was being identified as a potential vector for spiritual corruption. However, the Inquisitor continued, I have also seen evidence of true faith, of souls crying out for proper guidance and instruction. It is my duty to nurture this spiritual hunger while rooting out the influences that threaten to lead the faithful astray. He gestured toward the platform. Therefore, we shall begin a program of daily moral instruction designed to replace worldly entertainment with spiritual edification. Those who have made their living through frivolous pursuits will have the opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to serving God's purposes instead. The trap was elegant and inescapable. Thomas was being offered a choice that was no choice at all. Transform his performances into religious instruction or be branded as irredeemably corrupted. Failure to comply would be seen as resistance to church authority, while compliance would require him to abandon everything that had defined his existence. As Father Benedict continued his address, outlining his vision for a reformed court dedicated to spiritual elevation rather than worldly pleasure, Thomas felt the walls of his world closing in around him. The man was not content to simply suppress entertainment. He wanted to transform it into something unrecognizable, to use the same mechanisms that had brought joy to instead deliver moral instruction. Step forward, fool, Father Benedict commanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Let us see if your talents can be redirected toward more worthy purposes. Thomas walked to the platform on legs that felt disconnected from his body, his bells chiming with each step in a rhythm that now sounded like a funeral march. The assembled nobles watched with the fascination of spectators at an execution, understanding that they were witnessing the death of something that had been central to their court's identity. Tell us a story, Father Benedict instructed, but let it be one that illuminates moral truth rather than encouraging frivolous laughter. Show us that entertainment can serve God's purposes when properly directed. It was perhaps the most difficult performance of his life. Thomas had to take everything he knew about storytelling, about engaging an audience and holding their attention, and apply it to material that felt foreign to his nature. He told a tale about a proud merchant who learned humility through adversity, incorporating physical gestures and vocal variations to maintain interest while ensuring every element served a didactic purpose. The story was competently told and appropriately moral, but it felt like a betrayal of everything he had ever believed about the power of performance to bring genuine joy to others. When he finished, the applause was polite, but subdued, carrying none of the warmth and delight that had once rewarded his efforts. Acceptable, Father Benedict pronounced, his tone suggesting that acceptance was itself a form of mercy. We see that even those who have strayed from proper purpose can be guided back to righteousness when properly instructed. But Thomas understood that this was only the beginning. Each day would bring new tests, new requirements to prove his spiritual transformation was genuine rather than mere compliance. He would have to learn an entirely new form of performance, one that satisfied the Inquisitor's demands, while maintaining enough engagement to serve its intended purpose. As the meal concluded and the nobles dispersed to their evening activities, Thomas noticed Mary approaching him with the same careful precision she brought to all her movements. Under the pretense of clearing away some items from the platform, she managed to position herself close enough for private conversation. "That was well done," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of departing footsteps. "You showed wisdom in adapting rather than resisting. But this is only the first step in a longer journey." "What kind of journey?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life even further. "One that requires patience, faith, and the understanding that sometimes the best way to preserve what matters is to allow it to appear transformed while keeping its essence hidden," she replied. "There are others who share this understanding, who know that survival sometimes requires seeming to become what our enemies wish us to be." Before he could respond, she had moved away, leaving him alone on the platform with the weight of her words and the growing realization that the castle held depths of resistance and resilience that he was only beginning to discover. That night, in the cramped confines of his chamber, Thomas sat surrounded by the tools of his former trade and contemplated the magnitude of the transformation being demanded of him. The juggling balls that had brought so much delight to children now seemed like evidence of spiritual frivolity. The musical instruments that had accompanied countless songs of joy and celebration were now potential instruments of corruption. But as he handled each familiar object, he began to see them differently. Perhaps there was a way to honor their essential purpose while adapting their use to meet new requirements. A juggling routine could become a demonstration of divine order and balance. Songs could carry spiritual messages while maintaining their emotional power. Stories could teach moral lessons while still touching the human heart. The challenge would be maintaining the authenticity that had always been the source of his connection with his audience. Even in this new role as moral instructor, he would need to find ways to reach people genuinely, to create moments of real understanding and shared feeling within the constraints of acceptable religious expression. Outside his window, the castle settled into another night of uneasy sleep. In the tower, Father Benedict continued his examination of Willem, seeking confessions that would justify his presence and validate his methods. In chambers throughout the keep, nobles lay awake, wondering how to navigate this new reality, where spiritual fitness had become the primary measure of worth. And in the network of relationships that Mary seemed to coordinate, plans were being made, alliances strengthened, and strategies developed for preserving what could be preserved, while appearing to embrace the transformation that Father Benedict demanded. The game had indeed changed, but it was far from over. In the spaces between official doctrine and human need, between public compliance and private resistance, there remained room for the kind of authentic connection that had always been Thomas's greatest gift. The challenge now was learning to exercise that gift in ways that served both survival and something deeper, the preservation of the human spirit in times when humanity itself seemed under attack. As sleep finally claimed him, Thomas dreamed of performances yet to come, of stories that could satisfy inquisitors while secretly nourishing the souls of those who heard them, of a future where entertainment and instruction might find a way to coexist without destroying each other. It was a fragile hope, but in the darkness of these troubled times, even fragile hope was precious beyond measure. 3 days had passed since Father Benedict's arrival, and the castle had settled into an uneasy rhythm of enforced piety and careful observation. The morning bells that called the faithful to prayer now seemed to echo with an ominous tone, and even the servants moved through their duties with the measured steps of people who knew they were being watched. Thomas woke each dawn to the sound of construction continuing in the courtyard, not the scaffold he had initially feared, but something perhaps more troubling, a permanent platform for daily moral instruction, complete with carved religious symbols, and a lectern from which approved messages could be delivered. The sight of it reminded him constantly that his transformation was not temporary, but a fundamental change in the very nature of his existence. The great hall had been reorganized entirely, with religious tapestries replacing some of the more secular decorations, and additional crucifixes mounted at strategic points to remind everyone of their spiritual obligations. Even the arrangement of tables had been modified to facilitate Father Benedict's daily addresses, creating a space that felt more like a chapel than a dining hall. As Thomas made his way through the morning routine that had become both familiar and alien, he reflected on how quickly the human spirit could adapt to circumstances that would have seemed impossible just days before. The nobles spoke in hushed, reverent tones about matters that previously would have inspired boisterous debate. The servants performed their duties with an efficiency born of fear rather than pride in their work. Yet beneath this surface compliance, he had begun to sense something else, a network of quiet resistance, carefully coordinated and expertly hidden. It centered around Mary, the seemingly insignificant servant who moved through the castle with the purposeful invisibility of someone who understood exactly how power flowed through these ancient stones. During the morning meal, Thomas observed the intricate dance of communication that Mary had orchestrated among the castle's inhabitants. A serving woman would pause slightly longer than necessary while refilling a wine cup, allowing the recipient to whisper a few words. A page would deliver messages that took circuitous routes through the castle, ensuring that multiple people received information through apparently coincidental encounters. Lady Margaret had become a key figure in this network, her position as chatelaine providing legitimate reasons to coordinate household activities while actually managing something far more complex. When she summoned servants to discuss linens or meal preparations, these conversations carried deeper significance that only those initiated into the network could fully understand. Sir Edmund, too, seemed to have been drawn into Mary's web of influence. His patrols of the castle grounds and training sessions with the men-at-arms provided opportunities for private conversations away from Father Benedict's watchful eye. The knight's natural authority among the soldiers made him invaluable for maintaining morale and preventing the kind of despair that could lead to dangerous acts of open rebellion. Even Brother Francis had revealed himself to be more than a simple keeper of books and spiritual advisor. His access to religious texts and his understanding of theological arguments provided a crucial service to the network, finding scriptural justification for resistance to what he privately considered an abuse of ecclesiastical authority. Thomas began to understand that he was being evaluated for inclusion in this hidden community, tested to determine whether he could be trusted with knowledge that could cost lives if revealed. The conversations he had witnessed between Mary and Brother Francis, the The meaningful glances exchanged during meals, the careful phrasing of seemingly innocent requests, all of it was part of an elaborate screening process. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. On one hand, it offered hope that he was not alone in his struggle against Father Benedict's oppressive reforms. On the other, it made him aware that the stakes were far higher than his own survival. There were others whose safety might depend on his ability to maintain absolute discretion. The test came during his fourth performance under the new regime. Father Benedict had requested a story about the dangers of pride, a theme that allowed for multiple interpretations depending on the listener's perspective. Thomas had prepared carefully, crafting a tale that would satisfy the Inquisitor's requirements while potentially carrying deeper meanings for those who knew how to listen. But as he began his performance, he noticed Mary positioned herself where she could observe not just him, but the reactions of specific individuals in the audience. Her presence was both encouraging and nerve-wracking. He sensed that this performance would determine whether he was worthy of the trust that seemed to be offered. The story he told was about a merchant who accumulated great wealth through honest trade, but gradually became convinced that his success came entirely from his own cleverness rather than divine providence. As his pride grew, he began to ignore the needs of others until circumstances humbled him and taught him that true security came only through faith and community. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of moral instruction Father Benedict had demanded, but Thomas wove into the narrative subtle references that those familiar with the castle's current situation would recognize, descriptions of the merchant's isolation that paralleled Father Benedict's separation from the community he claimed to serve, mentions of the importance of traditional wisdom that could be interpreted as support for the old ways the Inquisitor sought to suppress. The performance required extraordinary skill, delivering each line with the conviction necessary to satisfy Father Benedict while embedding meanings that could inspire those who felt their own traditions and beliefs under attack. It was like walking a tightrope over an abyss, where the slightest misstep could result in disaster for himself and others. When he finished, the applause was respectful but restrained, as had become normal under the new order. But Thomas caught a brief nod from Mary, a gesture so subtle that anyone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. He had passed the test. That evening, as the castle settled into its new routine of early retirement and private prayer, Thomas found himself summoned not to Lord Aldrich's chambers, but to the library where Brother Francis maintained his scholarly work. The old monk was alone, surrounded by manuscripts and scrolls that created pools of golden light in the candle-lit space. "Thomas," Brother Francis said, without preamble, "there are things you need to understand about our current situation. Father Benedict represents more than just religious reform. He is part of a broader movement within the Church that seeks to centralize authority and eliminate what they see as dangerous independence in local communities." The monk gestured toward a map spread across his writing desk, marked with symbols that indicated various monasteries, courts, and church holdings throughout the region. He has visited dozens of similar establishments, always with the same result. Traditional forms of expression are suppressed, local authority is undermined, and communities that once governed themselves are brought under direct ecclesiastical control. Thomas studied the map, beginning to understand the scope of the transformation being imposed across the kingdom. What happened to the entertainers in those other places? Some adapted, as you are attempting to do. Others, Brother Francis paused, his expression grave. Others were found to be irredeemably corrupted and dealt with accordingly. Father Benedict believes that removing sources of secular joy is essential to creating proper spiritual focus. The implications were clear. Thomas's survival depended not just on successfully adapting his performances, but on convincing Father Benedict that his transformation was genuine and complete. Any sign that he retained his former identity as a source of worldly pleasure could be fatal. But, Brother Francis continued, there are those who believe that joy and faith are not incompatible, that God's creation includes beauty and laughter, as well as solemnity and suffering. These people work quietly to preserve what can be preserved, while appearing to embrace the changes being imposed. Over the following days, Thomas was gradually introduced to the full scope of Mary's network. It included not just the castle's inhabitants, but connections that extended throughout the surrounding countryside. Traveling merchants carried messages between communities facing similar pressures. Monks from nearby monasteries shared information about Father Benedict's methods and plans. Even some of the Inquisitor's own servants had been recruited to provide intelligence about his private activities and correspondence. Mary herself proved to be far more than a simple servant. Her background remained mysterious, but her knowledge of politics, theology, and human nature suggested education and experience that went far beyond her current humble position. She spoke multiple languages, understood complex religious arguments, and demonstrated a strategic mind that could coordinate activities across vast distances without detection. The key, she explained during one of their carefully arranged meetings in the library, is to give Father Benedict exactly what he believes he wants, while preserving the essence of what he seeks to destroy. Your performances can satisfy his requirements for moral instruction while maintaining the emotional connection that makes entertainment valuable. She outlined a sophisticated approach to resistance that relied on subtlety rather than confrontation. Rather than directly opposing Father Benedict's reforms, the network worked to influence their implementation in ways that minimized harm to the community. Stories could carry hidden meanings, songs could preserve traditional melodies within approved religious frameworks, and festivals could be transformed rather than eliminated. Think of it as translation, Mary said. We are translating the essence of our culture into a language that Father Benedict can accept, while ensuring that those who understand the original meaning can still find it within the new forms. The concept was intellectually elegant but practically challenging. It required Thomas to master an entirely new form of performance art, one that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Every story had to work as moral instruction for Father Benedict while carrying deeper meanings for the network's members and maintaining enough entertainment value to serve its social function. A week after Willem's arrest, the entire castle was summoned to witness his public confession and sentencing. The platform that had been constructed for daily instruction was transformed into a stage for divine justice, decorated with religious banners, and surrounded by guards to ensure proper decorum during the proceedings. Willem was brought from the tower in chains, his appearance shocking to those who remembered him as a robust and confident craftsman. Days of interrogation had left him gaunt and broken, his eyes unfocused and his movements uncertain. The transformation was deliberate, designed to demonstrate the consequences of spiritual corruption and the mercy of those who offered redemption. Father Benedict presided over the proceedings with the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence on matters of eternal significance. His voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd as he detailed Willem's crimes against divine order and the evidence of his spiritual corruption that had been uncovered through careful examination. This man, the Inquisitor declared, allowed pagan traditions to corrupt his Christian faith. He practiced rituals that predate the gospel, seeking protection from forces other than our Lord and Savior. His workshop became a place where ancient superstitions were preserved and transmitted to others, undermining the spiritual health of this entire community. The charges sounded absurd when stated so formally, but the solemnity of the proceedings and Willem's obvious suffering gave them a weight that silenced any potential mockery. The assembled crowd listened in fearful silence, understanding that they were witnessing a demonstration of power that could easily be directed at any of them. Willem's confession, when it came, was carefully scripted to serve Father Benedict's purposes. He acknowledged his errors, expressed gratitude for the spiritual guidance that had revealed his corruption, and publicly renounced the practices that had led him astray. His voice was barely audible, whether from shame, fear, or physical exhaustion. But Thomas, listening carefully to the words and watching the blacksmith's face, began to suspect that even this confession was part of Mary's larger strategy. Willem's acknowledgement of error was phrased in ways that could be interpreted as genuine repentance by Father Benedict, while actually preserving his dignity for those who understood the circumstances of his situation. Willem's sentence was carefully calibrated to demonstrate both Father Benedict's authority and his mercy. Rather than death or permanent imprisonment, the blacksmith was condemned to public penance, daily religious instruction, community service under church supervision, and the forfeit of his independent workshop in favor of work directly overseen by ecclesiastical authority. It was a masterpiece of political theater that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Father Benedict appeared merciful and focused on redemption rather than punishment. The community was reminded of the consequences of straying from approved behavior, and Willem, while humiliated and stripped of his independence, retained his life and the possibility of eventual rehabilitation. But Thomas understood that this outcome had not been achieved through Father Benedict's inherent mercy. The careful phrasing of Willem's confession, the strategic presence of certain witnesses, and the subtle influence of network members throughout the proceedings had all contributed to a result that could have been much worse. As the crowd dispersed and normal castle activities resumed, Thomas found himself both impressed by the network's capabilities and sobered by the realization of what their opposition faced. Father Benedict was not a simple fanatic who could be easily outwitted. He was an intelligent and experienced opponent who understood the political dimensions of his mission as well as the religious ones. The weeks that followed established a new normal for the castle's daily life. Father Benedict's reforms were implemented systematically, with each change carefully designed to reinforce his authority while dismantling the traditional social structures that had previously governed community life. Entertainment was not eliminated entirely, but it was thoroughly transformed. Thomas's performances became elaborate moral instructions that satisfied the inquisitor's requirements while providing carefully managed emotional release for audiences starved of genuine joy. Music continued, but only in the form of religious hymns and approved spiritual songs. Dancing was forbidden except for specific religious festivals where it served liturgical purposes. Yet, within these constraints, Mary's network found ways to preserve elements of the culture Father Benedict sought to destroy. Traditional melodies were adapted to carry religious lyrics, but those who knew the original words could still hear them in the underlying musical structure. Stories were reframed as moral instruction, but their essential human truths remained intact for those who knew how to listen. Thomas discovered that his new role as moral instructor actually provided opportunities that his previous position as entertainer had not. The expectation that his performances would carry deeper meaning encouraged audiences to listen more carefully, to think about the messages being delivered, and to engage with ideas rather than simply seeking passive amusement. His stories began to attract attention beyond their immediate audience. People would approach him after performances to discuss the themes he had explored, to ask questions about moral philosophy, and to share their own reflections on the challenges of living faithfully in difficult times. These conversations revealed a hunger for intellectual and spiritual engagement that surprised him with its depth and sophistication. Brother Francis proved invaluable in helping Thomas develop this new form of performance art. The old monk's extensive knowledge of religious texts and moral philosophy provided source material for stories that could satisfy Father Benedict's requirements while exploring genuinely meaningful themes. The great stories of our faith, Brother Francis explained during one of their evening sessions, have always operated on multiple levels. The parables of Christ himself appear simple on the surface, but contain profound truths that reveal themselves through contemplation and discussion. Together, they developed a repertoire of stories that drew from biblical sources, the lives of saints, and classical moral philosophy. Each tale was crafted to work as entertainment, instruction, and inspiration simultaneously. The challenge was ensuring that the spiritual messages were genuine rather than merely conventional, that the performances touched hearts as well as minds. Thomas found himself studying theology and philosophy with an intensity he had never brought to any subject before. His survival depended on understanding not just the surface requirements of his new role, but the deeper intellectual currents that informed Father Benedict's worldview and the alternative perspectives that Mary's network sought to preserve. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest period of intellectual growth was occurring under circumstances that were intended to diminish and control him. Father Benedict's reforms, designed to suppress independent thinking, had actually forced him to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between entertainment, education, and spiritual development. 2 months after Father Benedict's arrival, the first signs of success in the network's resistance strategy began to emerge. The Inquisitor, pleased with what he perceived as the complete transformation of the castle's spiritual culture, began to speak of his mission there as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. His reports to church superiors emphasized the thoroughness of his reforms and the enthusiasm with which they had been embraced by the local population. Willem's confession and rehabilitation were cited as evidence of his effective methods, while Thomas's transformation from secular entertainer to moral instructor demonstrated the possibility of redemption even for those most deeply corrupted by worldly concerns. But this apparent success created new dangers for the network. Father Benedict's confidence in his achievements made him less vigilant about potential opposition, but it also meant that any evidence of continued resistance would be seen as a direct challenge to his authority and effectiveness. The network had to be more careful than ever to maintain the appearance of complete compliance while continuing their work of cultural preservation. Every conversation, every gesture, every expression had to be calculated to reinforce Father Benedict's perception of success while actually serving the community's real needs. Thomas's performances became increasingly sophisticated during this period, incorporating layers of meaning that satisfied multiple audiences simultaneously. Father Benedict heard moral instruction that reinforced his religious message. Network members heard coded references to shared values and hidden support for traditional practices. The general population heard stories that provided emotional sustenance while teaching valuable lessons about survival under oppressive circumstances. The skill required for such multi-layered communication was exhausting, but it also provided a sense of purpose that Thomas had never experienced in his previous role as simple entertainer. He was not just making people laugh or even teaching moral lessons. He was helping to preserve the essential humanity of a community under attack. Yet, even as the network celebrated its apparent success, Thomas could not shake the feeling that they were walking on increasingly thin ice. Father Benedict was intelligent and experienced, and his apparent satisfaction with their compliance might be masking a deeper awareness of what was actually occurring. The Inquisitor's questions during their occasional private conversations were becoming more pointed, his observations more detailed, and his expectations more specific. Thomas sensed that a test was coming, one that would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of everything Mary's network had worked to preserve. As autumn approached and the days grew shorter, the castle prepared for the arrival of winter and the challenges it would bring. Father Benedict announced that he would extend his stay through the cold months, using the time to complete his documentation of the community's spiritual transformation and to train local authorities in maintaining the reforms he had implemented. This news was received with carefully modulated enthusiasm by the castle's inhabitants, who understood that several more months under the Inquisitor's direct supervision would test their ability to maintain their careful facade of compliance. The network would need to operate with even greater caution while continuing to provide the emotional and cultural sustenance that kept the community's spirit alive. Thomas found himself at the center of these preparations, his role as moral instructor making him both valuable to Father Benedict's mission and essential to the network's resistance. His performances would need to evolve once again, providing entertainment that could sustain the castle's inhabitants through the dark months, while continuing to satisfy the Inquisitor's requirements for spiritual edification. The challenge seemed almost impossible, but Thomas had learned that survival often required attempting the impossible and somehow finding ways to succeed. His transformation from simple entertainer to moral instructor to cultural preservationist had taught him that human adaptability was perhaps the greatest gift God had given to those who found themselves living under impossible circumstances. As he prepared for the trials ahead, Thomas reflected on how much he had changed since Father Benedict's arrival. The man who had once lived entirely for the laughter of others had discovered depths of purpose and meaning he had never suspected. The bells he wore still marked him as different from others, but they no longer felt like symbols of humiliation. They had become badges of service to something larger than himself. The winter would test everything they had built together, but Thomas faced it with a confidence born of understanding his true role in the community's survival. He was no longer just a jester trying to avoid punishment for bringing joy to others. He was a guardian of the human spirit, using every skill at his disposal to ensure that light could survive even in the darkest times. The game was far from over, and the stakes continued to rise with each passing day. But Thomas had allies now, and purpose that went beyond simple survival. Whatever challenges the coming months might bring, he would face them as part of something larger than himself, a network of souls committed to preserving what was best in human nature, even when the forces arrayed against them seemed overwhelming. In the quiet moments before sleep, surrounded by the familiar tools of his trade that had taken on new meanings and new purposes, Thomas allowed himself to hope that spring might bring not just the return of warmth to the physical world, but the possibility of genuine renewal for the community that had become his true family. The bells beside his bed lay silent in the darkness, but they no longer felt like symbols of captivity. They had become instruments of a more subtle music, the rhythm of resistance, the melody of hope, and the harmony of human beings refusing to surrender their essential dignity, no matter what forces might seek to diminish them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new performances, and new opportunities to serve both survival and something deeper. But tonight, for the first time in months, Thomas slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he was no longer alone in his struggle to preserve joy in a world that had forgotten how to value it. Winter came early that year, settling over the castle like a gray shroud that seemed to muffle sound and slow time itself. The first snows fell in November, unusually heavy for the season, and by December, the castle was effectively isolated from the outside world by drifts that made travel impossible for all but the most urgent missions. For Thomas and the hidden network that had become his lifeline, this isolation was both blessing and curse. It provided protection from outside interference, but it also meant that they would spend the darkest months of the year under Father Benedict's constant supervision with no hope of relief. The great hall had been transformed yet again for the winter months, with additional braziers providing warmth and religious banners, replacing the seasonal decorations that had traditionally marked the passing of the year. Father Benedict had established a routine of daily morning assemblies where the entire castle community would gather for prayers, instruction, and the kind of moral guidance that he believed essential for maintaining spiritual health during the challenging winter season. Thomas's role in these gatherings had evolved beyond simple performance into something approaching genuine ministry, though of a kind that would have been unrecognizable to him just months before. His stories had become more sophisticated, incorporating theological concepts that he had learned through his intensive study with Brother Francis, while maintaining the emotional resonance that made them effective as entertainment and instruction simultaneously. The first real test of the winter came in January, when a series of storms trapped the castle for nearly 2 weeks, with no possibility of communication with the outside world. Food stores, which had seemed adequate in autumn, began to run low as the isolation extended beyond what anyone had planned for. Tempers grew short, and the kind of tensions that could lead to dangerous conflicts began to surface among people forced to live in close proximity with no relief. It was during this period that Thomas truly understood the importance of his transformed role in the community. His evening performances, originally designed to satisfy Father Benedict's requirements for moral instruction, had become essential for maintaining morale and preventing the kind of despair that could lead to violence or desperation. The stories he told during those dark January nights were different from anything he had performed before. They were tales of endurance and hope, of communities that had survived through cooperation and faith, of individuals who had found meaning and purpose even in the most challenging circumstances. Each story was carefully crafted to speak to the specific anxieties and needs of his trapped audience, while maintaining the religious framework that Father Benedict required. One evening, when the storm had been raging for 5 days and food rations had been reduced for the second time, Thomas told a story about a village trapped by an avalanche that had learned to find sustenance not just in their dwindling food stores, but in the strength they drew from supporting each other through shared hardship. The tale was ostensibly about the importance of Christian charity and mutual aid, but everyone in the hall understood its deeper relevance to their current situation. Father Benedict, who had been growing increasingly concerned about the community's morale as the isolation continued, praised Thomas's performance as an example of how entertainment could serve God's purposes by providing spiritual nourishment during times of trial. But the Inquisitor's praise carried an undertone that suggested he was also evaluating the effectiveness of his reforms under stress. The network's response to these challenges revealed the depth of planning and preparation that Mary had invested in their hidden infrastructure. Carefully hoarded supplies appeared when they were most needed, distributed through channels that made their origins untraceable. Information about the community's emotional state was gathered and shared, allowing those in positions of influence to address problems before they became dangerous. Most importantly, the network provided a sense of shared purpose and hidden solidarity that helped people endure hardships that might otherwise have broken their spirit. Knowing that their suffering was witnessed and understood by others, that their endurance served a larger purpose beyond simple survival, gave meaning to sacrifices that could otherwise have seemed pointless. As the winter deepened and the isolation continued, an unexpected development began to emerge from the constraints that Father Benedict had imposed on the castle's cultural life. The daily religious instruction and moral education that the Inquisitor required had created an environment where serious intellectual discussion was not just permitted but encouraged, provided it remained within acceptable theological boundaries. Brother Francis, working closely with Mary's network, had begun to organize what amounted to a hidden academy within the castle's official religious programming. The library sessions that had originally served as cover for network meetings had evolved into genuine educational gatherings where people could explore ideas and engage in the kind of intellectual discourse that had been largely absent from castle life before Father Benedict's arrival. Thomas became both student and teacher in this informal educational community. His performances provided case studies for discussions about the relationship between entertainment and moral instruction, while his growing knowledge of theology and philosophy allowed him to contribute to conversations about topics far removed from his original expertise as a simple entertainer. The irony was profound. Father Benedict's efforts to suppress secular learning and independent thinking had actually created conditions that fostered more sophisticated intellectual engagement than the castle had previously known. By requiring that all entertainment serve educational purposes, the Inquisitor had elevated the level of discourse and encouraged people to think more deeply about the messages they received and the ideas they shared. Lady Margaret had emerged as one of the most active participants in these hidden educational activities, her position as chatelaine providing legitimate reasons to coordinate what appeared to be domestic activities, but were actually sophisticated discussions about governance, ethics, and social responsibility. By February, Thomas had mastered the complex art of multi-layered communication that allowed him to satisfy Father Benedict's requirements while serving the network's needs for coded information and emotional support. His performances had become sophisticated exercises in symbolic communication, where every gesture, every emphasis, every pause carried meanings that could be understood by those who knew how to interpret them. A story about the importance of loyalty to legitimate authority could simultaneously convey support for resistance to illegitimate oppression, depending on how the audience understood the nature of true legitimacy. A tale about the dangers of pride could serve as both a warning against spiritual arrogance and a subtle criticism of Father Benedict's assumption of absolute moral authority. The development of this communication system had required extensive preparation and practice. Thomas spent hours with Brother Francis and Mary, learning to encode messages in ways that would be invisible to Father Benedict while clear to network members. The old monk's expertise in theological interpretation proved invaluable in finding scriptural precedents for ideas that might otherwise be seen as rebellious or heretical. The success of this communication system was demonstrated by its effects on community morale. Despite the continued isolation and hardship of the winter months, the castle's inhabitants seemed to draw strength from the knowledge that their true values and beliefs were being preserved and honored, even if they had to be expressed in disguised form. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation of the winter months was Thomas's own evolution from entertainer to scholar. His intensive study with Brother Francis had opened intellectual horizons that he had never suspected existed, while his practical work in developing sophisticated performance techniques had given him insights into human nature and communication that went far beyond anything he had learned during his years as a simple jester. The man who had once lived entirely for the immediate gratification of making others laugh had discovered the deeper satisfaction of helping people think, of contributing to their understanding of themselves and their world, of serving purposes that extended far beyond the moment of performance. This transformation was tested in March when Father Benedict announced that he would be documenting Thomas's rehabilitation as part of his report to church authorities about the success of his mission. The Inquisitor had decided that Thomas's transformation from secular entertainer to moral instructor represented a perfect example of the kind of spiritual renewal that could be achieved through proper guidance and discipline. The examination that followed was perhaps the most challenging intellectual test of Thomas's life. Father Benedict questioned him extensively about his understanding of theological principles, his methods for ensuring that his performances served religious rather than secular purposes, and his personal spiritual development since embracing his new role as moral instructor. But Thomas was prepared. Months of study and discussion had given him a sophisticated understanding of the theological framework within which he was expected to operate. More importantly, his work with the network had taught him to navigate complex questions about authority, obedience, and the proper relationship between individual conscience and institutional demands. His responses satisfied Father Benedict completely, demonstrating not just compliance with required doctrine, but genuine engagement with the intellectual challenges of his transformed role. The Inquisitor's notes praised his complete spiritual rehabilitation and recommended him as a model for similar transformations in other communities. But Thomas understood that this apparent success was itself dangerous. Father Benedict's satisfaction with his transformation made the Inquisitor less likely to look for hidden meanings in his performances. But it also meant that any evidence of continued connection to secular values would be seen as a profound betrayal. As winter gradually loosened its grip on the castle and the first signs of spring began to appear, the community faced the reality that Father Benedict's extended stay was approaching its end. The Inquisitor had announced his intention to depart with the first reliable traveling weather, taking with him documentation of his successful reforms and recommendations for maintaining the spiritual discipline he had imposed. This approaching departure created both relief and anxiety among the network's members. While they looked forward to the end of constant supervision, they also understood that the true test of their resistance strategy would come after Father Benedict left. Would they be able to maintain the appearance of continued compliance while gradually restoring elements of their traditional culture? Mary's network had spent months preparing for this transition, developing plans for gradually reintroducing traditional practices in ways that could be justified as consistent with Father Benedict's reforms. Music could be expanded beyond strictly religious themes by incorporating folk melodies into sacred compositions. Stories could explore secular themes by framing them as moral instruction. Thomas's role in this transition was crucial. His performances would need to serve as both testing ground and vehicle for cultural renewal, allowing the community to explore how much of their traditional identity could be safely restored while maintaining the religious framework that provided protection from future interference. Father Benedict's departure, when it finally came in early April, was marked by ceremony and formality that reflected his satisfaction with the transformation he believed he had achieved. The entire castle community gathered to bid farewell to the man who had challenged their deepest assumptions about the relationship between spiritual and secular life. Thomas was called upon to deliver a farewell performance that would demonstrate the lasting effects of Father Benedict's guidance and instruction. The story he told was about a community that had learned to find joy in serving God's purposes rather than pursuing worldly pleasures, a tale that appeared to celebrate everything the Inquisitor had worked to achieve. But those who knew how to listen heard deeper meanings in the story, messages about the importance of preserving essential human values, even when their expression must be transformed, about the strength that comes from community solidarity in the face of external pressure, about the possibility of finding authentic spiritual meaning within institutional frameworks that might initially seem oppressive. Father Benedict's response to the performance confirmed that Thomas's transformation had exceeded even the Inquisitor's expectations. His final notes praised the castle's complete spiritual renewal and recommended that Thomas's methods be studied and replicated in other communities facing similar challenges. As the Inquisitor's party disappeared down the road that led away from the castle, the community was left to contemplate the future they would create together. The immediate pressure of constant supervision was gone, but the deeper questions about how to live authentically within the constraints of institutional power remained as relevant as ever. In the weeks that followed Father Benedict's departure, the castle gradually began to explore the possibilities that his absence created. Thomas's performances evolved to include more explicit references to traditional themes and values, though always within the religious framework that provided protection from future scrutiny. Music expanded to incorporate folk melodies and secular themes, presented as moral instruction. But the most significant change was in the community's understanding of itself and its capacity for resilience and renewal. The experience of surviving Father Benedict's reforms through careful coordination and mutual support had created new forms of social connection that transcended traditional hierarchies and created more inclusive forms of community participation. Mary's network had evolved from a resistance organization into a permanent institution for community coordination and cultural development. Her insights into human psychology and social organization had proven so valuable that she was quietly acknowledged as one of the castle's most important leaders. Despite her officially humble status, Thomas himself had found a form of authenticity that exceeded anything he had experienced during his previous life as a simple entertainer. His performances now served purposes that connected his individual talents to larger community needs and values. The bells he wore had become symbols not of humiliation, but of service to something greater than himself. As he prepared for sleep on what had become a typical summer evening in the transformed castle, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him from desperate jester seeking to avoid punishment to confident scholar performer serving community needs that extended far beyond simple entertainment. The man beneath the bells had not been lost in the transformation, but had been revealed as more complex and capable than anyone, including himself, had previously suspected. The tools of his trade, the juggling balls, the musical instruments, the colorful scarves, had acquired new purposes and meanings while retaining their essential function of creating connection between performer and audience. The stories he told continued to bring joy and laughter, but they also provided education, inspiration, and the kind of spiritual nourishment that helped people find meaning in their daily struggles. The bells beside his bed lay silent in the darkness, but Thomas understood that their music was eternal, not the specific sounds they made when he moved, but the larger rhythm they represented. It was the rhythm of human adaptation, of communities finding ways to preserve what mattered most while transforming what needed to change, of individuals discovering that their greatest fulfillment came through service to purposes larger than themselves. In the morning, the bells would chime again as he began another day of performance, education, and community service. There would be new stories to tell, new audiences to engage, new challenges to address through the careful application of skills that had been refined through trial and transformation. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of his small chamber, Thomas rested in the knowledge that he had found his true calling, not as a jester seeking to make others laugh, but as a guardian of the human spirit. The great performance that was human community would continue, with all its comedy and tragedy, its moments of brilliance and periods of struggle. Thomas had learned to play his part not as a separate entertainer, but as an integral voice in the larger symphony, his bells adding their unique music to the eternal song of people finding ways to live together with dignity, purpose, and hope. And in that music, barely audible in the quiet castle night, future generations would hear echoes of all those who had faced similar challenges and found similar solutions, the endless creativity of human beings refusing to surrender their essential humanity, no matter what forces might seek to diminish them. The bells of the jester had become the bells of the church, calling all who heard them to remember that laughter and tears, wisdom and folly, suffering and joy were all part of the sacred dance of being fully human in an uncertain world. The seasons continued their ancient cycle around the castle, each bringing new challenges and opportunities for the community that had learned to adapt without losing its essential character. Thomas's performances evolved with the changing needs of his audience, incorporating lessons learned from each crisis survived and each small victory achieved through collective effort and mutual support. Summer brought traveling merchants and news from the outside world, information about other communities that had faced similar pressures from church authorities and the various strategies they had developed for maintaining their cultural identity within acceptable religious frameworks. Some had been less successful than Thomas's castle, their traditional ways completely suppressed or their resistance discovered and punished. Others had found different paths to the same goal, developing their own methods for preserving what mattered most while appearing to embrace the changes demanded by institutional authority. These stories became part of Thomas's repertoire, carefully adapted to serve both as entertainment and as instruction in the subtle arts of cultural preservation. His audiences learned not just from his performances, but from the examples of others who had faced similar challenges, building a collective wisdom about how to navigate the complex relationship between individual conscience and external authority. Autumn brought harvest celebrations that had been carefully redesigned to emphasize their religious significance while maintaining their essential character as community gatherings. Thomas's role in these events had expanded beyond simple performance to include coordination of activities that brought people together in ways that strengthened social bonds while satisfying Father Benedict's continuing influence through the local clergy who maintained oversight of the community's spiritual development. The skills he had developed in multi-layered communication proved valuable in organizing these events, ensuring that they served multiple purposes simultaneously. Religious observance satisfied church requirements. Community celebration provided emotional sustenance for people who had endured months of constraint and fear, and cultural preservation allowed traditional practices to continue in the modified form. Winter returned, as it always did, but the community faced it with confidence born of experience and preparation. The network that Mary had established had become a permanent part of the castle's social infrastructure, providing coordination and support that helped people navigate not just external pressures, but the ordinary challenges of life. In a complex community, Thomas's evening performances during the dark months had become an established tradition that people anticipated and relied upon for both entertainment and spiritual nourishment. The stories he told continued to evolve, incorporating new themes and ideas while maintaining the essential elements that made them effective as vehicles for building community, understanding, and shared purpose. As years passed, and Thomas's reputation as both performer and teacher grew beyond the castle's boundaries, he began to train others in the arts he had developed through necessity and refined through practice. Young people who showed aptitude for performance and communication were quietly recruited to learn not just the techniques of entertainment, but the deeper skills of cultural preservation and community leadership. This informal educational program operated within the broader framework of religious instruction that continued to provide legitimacy and protection for activities that might otherwise be seen as potentially subversive. Students learned to read and write, to understand theological arguments, and to navigate complex social and political situations while developing their own approaches to the challenges of maintaining authentic human community within institutional constraints. The library that Brother Francis maintained had expanded to include works that documented the community's experiences and the methods they had developed for addressing various challenges. These records, carefully written in language that could be interpreted as religious instruction, actually constituted a sophisticated manual for cultural resistance and renewal that could be studied by future generations facing similar difficulties. Mary's role in this educational effort was crucial. Her understanding of human psychology and social organization, providing the theoretical framework within which practical skills could be developed and applied. Her network had become a laboratory for exploring new approaches to community governance and mutual support, testing ideas that could be adapted by other groups facing their own versions of external pressure and internal discord. The success of these efforts was measured not in dramatic victories or public recognition, but in the quiet satisfaction of people who had learned to live authentically within constraints that might have seemed impossible to survive. The castle had become a model of resilience and adaptation that attracted attention from communities throughout the region, though always in ways that maintained the appearance of religious orthodoxy and institutional compliance. Thomas's bells had indeed become symbols of something larger than his individual journey from humiliation to purpose. They represented the possibility of transformation without surrender, of adaptation without abandonment of essential values, of service to community needs while maintaining personal integrity. The sound they made as he moved through the castle on his daily rounds had become a comfort to people who associated it with stability, wisdom, and the kind of authentic human connection that helped them find meaning in their daily struggles. Children who had grown up hearing those bells understood them as symbols of hope rather than markers of otherness, proof that even the most constrained circumstances could be transformed into opportunities for genuine service and personal growth. The stories Thomas told continued to reach new audiences as travelers carried them to other communities, and other performers adapted them for their own purposes. The techniques he had developed for encoding complex meanings within apparently simple narratives became part of a larger tradition of resistance literature that helped people throughout the region maintain their cultural identity while navigating the political and religious pressures of their time. But perhaps most importantly, the community itself had become a living example of what was possible when people committed themselves to preserving what was best in human nature while adapting to changing circumstances. The relationships that had formed through shared struggle and mutual support had created new forms of social organization that transcended traditional hierarchies and provided models for more inclusive and responsive governance. As Thomas prepared for another night's rest in his small chamber, surrounded by the tools and symbols of a life dedicated to service rather than personal advancement, he understood that his individual story was part of something much larger and more enduring. The bells would continue to chime long after he was gone, calling future generations to remember that the human spirit could not be permanently constrained by any institutional framework, no matter how comprehensive or authoritative it might appear. The great performance of human community would continue, with new actors taking the stage, and new challenges requiring creative responses. But the essential truth that Thomas had discovered through his own transformation would remain constant, that authentic life was always possible for those willing to serve purposes larger than themselves. That community could survive any external pressure through mutual support and shared commitment to essential values. And that hope could be preserved even in the darkest times through the simple act of refusing to surrender one's fundamental humanity. In the gentle rhythm of his breathing, as sleep approached, Thomas could hear the eternal music that his bells had learned to play, the sound of people choosing courage over fear, wisdom over ignorance, love over hatred, hope over despair. It was a quiet music, easily missed by those who listened only for dramatic crescendos, but it was the most important sound in the world for those who understood that the future of human civilization depended on such small, daily acts of faith in the possibility of something better